That night, I called my son 5 times. Nothing. At 2 in the morning, a state trooper called me instead. "Sir, are you the registered owner of a 1938 Beechcraft Staggerwing that just crash-landed on Interstate 25 and struck a patrol vehicle?" I drove to the scene barefoot, still in my work coveralls. Jesse was sitting on the highway median wrapped in a shock blanket, pointing straight at me. He killed that engineer. He made me fly the plane to get rid of the body. My wife stood behind the troopers with her arms folded and said, "They have everything they need, Ed. Just stop." They thought they had built the perfect trap. But they forgot one thing. That plane had been recording every second of the truth. Thank you for joining me today. Drop a comment below and let me know where you are watching from. Your country or your city. Also, please note that this story includes some fictional elements added for entertainment and educational purposes. Any resemblance to actual names or settings is purely coincidental. But the message I am sharing is truly valuable. I would love to hear your thoughts. My name is Ed Navarro. I am 63 years old, and I have spent more than half my life with my hands inside an aircraft. I know what a radial engine sounds like when a cylinder is losing compression before the oil pressure gauge even flickers. I know the difference between a magneto-timing drift and a voltage regulator fault just by the way the engine stumbles on startup. I can walk into a cold hangar at 5 in the morning, breathe in once, and tell you whether the last engine that ran in that building was burning avgas clean or running rich enough to foul the plugs by lunchtime. 36 years of sheet metal and safety wire and busted knuckles have given me a kind of mechanical instinct that most people would never understand. And honestly, I stopped trying to explain it a long time ago. What I could not diagnose, and what I should have seen coming long before that night in March, was the kind of damage that does not show up on any instrument panel. No oil pressure drop. No warning light. No unusual vibration you can feel through the yoke and trace back to its source. Just a slow corrosion eating through the structure somewhere deep inside, invisible until the whole airframe comes apart in flight. I built Navarro Aviation from a leased hangar and a borrowed toolbox in 1989. Out at Double Eagle II Airport, on the West Mesa outside Albuquerque, where the wind comes off the desert in the afternoons hard enough to rock a Cessna on its tie-downs, and the sunsets bleed across the Sandia Mountains like something a painter would be embarrassed to put on canvas because nobody would believe the colors were real. I was 27 years old with a crop dusting license, a trade school certificate, and the kind of stubborn certainty that only belongs to young men who have not yet learned what the world charges for ambition. 36 years later, my name was still on the sign bolted to the front of Hangar 1. I had 3 bays, a parts room, a climate-controlled avionics workshop, and a reputation in the experimental and vintage aircraft community that I had earned one airframe at a time. The Beechcraft Staggerwing was the crown of all of it. A 1938 Model D-17, pulled from a collapsed barn in East Texas in 2016, as little more than a skeleton of rusted steel tube and rotted fabric. 9 years I spent on that aircraft. 9 years of hand-forming aluminum cowling panels over an English wheel, of rebuilding the Pratt & Whitney R985 radial from a seized block of corroded metal back to a running engine that could pull 450 horsepower at takeoff. 9 years of stitching grade-A cotton fabric over rebuilt wing ribs and brushing on coats of butyrate dope in a sealed room wearing a respirator, layer after layer, until the fabric was tight as a drumhead and smooth as glass. She had taken Grand Champion at EAA AirVenture in Oshkosh twice. She had won Best in Class at Copper State and Sun and Fun. She had flown formation over the Rio Grande, with a group of vintage biplanes on a morning so clear you could see the Jemez Mountains 80 miles north, and the sound of that radial engine echoing off the canyon walls was the closest thing to church I had ever known. She was not just an airplane. She was the best and most honest thing I had ever built with my own 2 hands. And she had been sitting in her spot on the tarmac behind Hangar 1 every single night for the past 15 years. I was still in the shop at 10:30 that night, finishing a magneto swap on a customer's Cessna 172 that had been sitting on the lift jack since Tuesday. The hangar was quiet, the way I liked it. Just the hum of the overhead fluorescent tubes and the occasional tick of cooling metal from the exhaust stack I had pulled 20 minutes earlier. I had turned 63 the previous October, and my lower back made certain I knew it by the end of every long shift, but I had never once considered cutting my hours short. This place was mine. I had earned every square foot of it. When I finished the job, I wiped my hands on a shop rag, killed the bay lights one by one, and walked out through the side door onto the tarmac where I always parked the Staggerwing. The wind had died down to almost nothing, and the desert sky was wide open above me. Stars scattered thick across the darkness, the way they only get out here on the mesa, where the city lights cannot reach them. The space was empty. I stood there for a long moment, not moving, just looking at the dark rectangle of oil-stained concrete where she should have been. The faint smell of avgas still hung in the air, which meant the engine had been started recently. Within the last few hours, I felt something cold move through my chest. Not panic. Something older and quieter than panic. The particular stillness that comes over you when the instrument panel lights up with something you have never seen before and you do not yet know whether you are going to land or not. I turned around, walked back inside, and sat down at the office computer. The GPS tracking software loaded slowly. The transponder signal I had installed showed the Beechcraft's last known position as the tarmac itself. The timestamp on the final ping read 10:41 in the evening. The signal had not faded the way it does when a battery dies or a connection weakens over distance. It had stopped clean. All at once. Like someone had physically pulled the relay from behind the instrument panel. I had installed that relay myself. I knew exactly where it sat. Tucked behind the lower right corner of the main panel. Secured with a single quarter-turn fastener that you could only reach if you knew to remove the access plate first. And I knew that the only people who had ever spent enough time in this hangar to learn the location of every access plate, every hidden relay, every bypass in every system I had built, were three people. Me, my longtime mechanic Tomas Reyes, and my son Jesse, who had grown up in this building and could navigate every corner of it blindfolded. Tomas was home with his family. I knew that without checking. I picked up my phone and called Margaret. She answered on the third ring. Her voice was flat. Not sleepy, not startled. Not the voice of a woman who had just been pulled out of bed at nearly 11 at night by a phone call from her husband. Flat in a way that told me she had been awake and waiting, though for what I could not yet say. Margaret, did someone move the Staggerwing? What do you mean, move it? It is not on the tarmac. The GPS signal cut out 45 minutes ago. A pause stretched between us. Not the pause of someone thinking. The pause of someone calculating. Maybe you are just tired, Ed. You have been putting in long nights out there. Maybe you forgot where you left it. I have parked that aircraft in the same spot for 15 years, Margaret. I kept my voice level with some effort. Is Jesse home? He went out earlier. I am not sure where. What time did he leave? Another pause. Shorter this time. Around 9, maybe. He did not say where he was going. I ended the call and tried Jesse's cell phone. 4 rings. Voicemail. I tried again. Voicemail. On the third attempt, I sat down in my office chair and stared at the dark monitor, letting myself think clearly instead of quickly. The Beechcraft had a second layer of security beyond the GPS. A kill switch I had designed and wired myself using a dedicated radio frequency transmitter completely independent of the satellite module. I had learned the concept from a fellow racer in the 90s, a man who lost a restored warbird to a theft ring and swore he would never let it happen again. The system was simple, a small receiver wired into the ignition circuit, listening on a single encrypted frequency. When I sent the cutoff command from the application on my phone, the engine would die. No override. No workaround. Unless you had the emergency bypass code I kept written on a piece of masking tape inside the top drawer of tool cabinet number 3. The drawer that Jesse knew as well as his own bedroom. I opened the application. The signal was broadcasting normally. The receiver was still powered. which meant the aircraft's electrical system was still live, wherever she was. At 10:47 in the evening, I pressed the command. Somewhere out over the New Mexico desert, if my Beechcraft was still in the air, its engine had just gone silent. 450 horsepower, reduced to nothing. The propeller, windmilling to a stop, and whoever was behind those controls was now sitting in a very quiet cockpit with nothing but gravity and whatever skill they possessed standing between them and the ground. I set the phone face down on the desk and sat in the silence of my empty hangar, listening to the fluorescent tubes buzz above me. I thought about the look on Margaret's face the last time Jesse had come to dinner, how she had laughed a little too quickly at everything he said, how she had watched him the way you watch something fragile. Not with love, exactly, but with the careful attention of someone managing a situation they cannot afford to let break open. 17 minutes passed. I did not move from that chair. Then my phone rang. Unknown number. New Mexico area code. I picked up immediately. Wind. Radio static. The tail end of a siren, powering down. Then Jesse's voice. Tight and breathless. Threaded with something that sounded like crying but carried no real grief behind it. Dad? A pause. There has been an accident. Before I could respond, another voice came across the line. Professional. Close to the receiver. Not waiting for permission. Sir, this is New Mexico State Police. Are you the registered owner of a 1938 Beechcraft Staggerwing? Tail number November 743, Tango Charlie? I was already on my feet, reaching for my truck keys off the hook, moving toward the door before I had consciously decided to move. Yes, I said. I am on my way. I did not know that driving there was the single action that would be used against me for the next 8 months of my life. I did not know that the scene I was driving toward had been constructed, at least in part, for my arrival. I only knew that my son had called me, and that whatever a father is, he goes. I saw the emergency lights before I reached the on-ramp. Blue and red strobes pulsing against the low desert sky, throwing sharp shadows across the scrubland and concrete barriers lining the highway. I pulled my truck to the shoulder 100 yards short and crossed the distance on foot at a run, my heart working harder than it had in years. The Beechcraft had come down on the northbound lanes. She had touched down steep and fast and desperate. The right main gear had collapsed on impact, slewing the aircraft sideways across 2 lanes before the right wing caught the concrete median and spun her nearly 180 degrees. The propeller blades were bent back against the cowling like broken fingers. Steam rose from the engine in thin white threads. A state patrol cruiser sat 15 feet away, with its rear quarter panel caved inward, where the left wingtip had caught it during the spin. Broken plexiglass and fragments of aluminum skin covered a wide arc of highway, catching the strobe light in flashes that made the whole scene look like a nightmare you cannot stop replaying after you wake. I stopped for 1 second and looked at what was left of 9 years of work. Then I kept moving, because my son was sitting on the highway median 30 feet away, and that mattered more. Jesse had a silver emergency blanket around his shoulders. A female paramedic crouched beside him. He was answering her questions in short responses, head bowed, hands loose between his knees. He looked shaken. I registered that with relief that dissolved the moment I reached him, and he looked up. I put my hand on his shoulder. Jesse, are you hurt? What happened? He met my eyes for a moment. Something moved across his face. Controlled. Quick. A door swinging shut. Then, he looked away. I'm okay. I'm fine. Jesse, look at me. How did this happen? Why did you take the aircraft? A voice came from my left. Calm. Authoritative. Sir, I need you to step back from him for a moment. The officer who had spoken was young. Early 30s, lean, with the composed manner of someone who had learned early how to control a scene without raising his voice. His nameplate caught the strobe light. Drucker, Ed Navarro, I said before he could ask. I am the registered owner. He is my son. Drucker wrote something in his notepad. Then he walked to the open cockpit door on the left side of the Beechcraft, leaned in with a flashlight, and scanned the interior methodically. He reached into the side storage compartment beside the pilot seat and withdrew something, holding it up briefly before placing it into an evidence bag held open by his partner. Even from 30 feet away in the flashing dark, I knew exactly what it was. The snap-on combination wrench, part of a limited production 2021 series I had ordered for the forged alloy composition. One of a set I kept in the locked tool cabinet in the hangar. Cabinet number 3. Behind a padlock. I changed every 6 months. I had never put that wrench inside that aircraft. Not once. Not ever. It was a precision instrument, not a flight tool. It had no business being in that cockpit, and whoever had put it there knew exactly where I kept it locked away. I turned back toward Jesse. I needed to understand something. I needed some version of his face that made sense to me. "Mark that wrench," I said, loud enough for Drucker to hear clearly. "It is from my shop. I did not put it in that aircraft." Drucker looked at me steadily. "We will document that, Mr. Navarro." He said it the way you say something to a man you have already decided is lying. Not dismissively, just with the particular patience of someone who has heard that kind of statement before and already knows how the rest of the conversation goes. I crossed the 30 feet of broken plexiglass and debris between me and the median where Jesse sat. The emergency blanket crinkled as he shifted slightly. The paramedic glanced up at me, but did not move away. "Jesse." I kept my voice low. Controlled. "Tell them this is a misunderstanding. Tell them what actually happened tonight." He was looking at the ground between his feet. His jaw was set. He did not respond. "Jesse, look at me." He did not. Drucker and his partner were moving toward me then. I heard Drucker say something quiet to the officer beside him, not directing it at me, just relaying information, unaware or unconcerned that I was close enough to catch every word. Dispatch confirmed the 911 call came in at 11:09. Caller was the son. Said the father had been drinking, killed a young woman earlier in the evening, and forced him to help move evidence using the aircraft. Said he was scared. Said the father has a history of violent behavior. The words reached me one at a time, like blows that come in a sequence you cannot brace for, because you do not believe the first one is real until the second one lands. My son had called the police. My son had called the police and told them I was a murderer. I looked at Jesse one more time. He had lifted his head now. He was watching me from across the wreckage of the aircraft I had loved for 15 years. He was not crying. He was not afraid. He was watching me the way you watch a clock. Calmly, without feeling. Waiting for the hand to reach the position you already know it will reach because you set the mechanism yourself. Officer Drucker's hand closed around my arm. Firm and practiced. "Mr. Navarro, I need you to come with me." I let him lead me toward the patrol cruiser. I did not fight. I did not shout. I looked at my son one last time over my shoulder, searching for something, anything, that resembled the boy I had raised, the boy who used to sit on an overturned fuel drum in the hangar and watch me rebuild cylinder heads for hours without saying a word. Just watching, absorbing, learning the patience that metal demands. There was nothing there I recognized, and somewhere in the cold, quiet part of my mind that still functioned while the rest of me was breaking apart, I understood that this was not the beginning of something. This had been building for a very long time. The question that would keep me awake in a cell for months to come was not how he had done it, but how long he had been planning to. They put me in interview room B at the New Mexico State Police District office at 4:17 in the morning. The room was small and deliberately uncomfortable. A metal table bolted to the floor, 2 chairs on opposite sides, a mirror along the left wall that was not fooling anyone. The fluorescent light overhead gave everything a bluish clinical tone, the kind of light that makes a healthy man look guilty and a guilty man look like he has already been convicted. I had been in rooms like this once before, years ago, as a witness after a runway incursion at Double Eagle, involving one of my student pilots. That time I walked out in 20 minutes. I already understood this time would be different. The detective who came in carried himself the way certain aircraft carry weight. Low center of gravity. Nothing wasted. He was in his early 50s, broad through the shoulders, with close-cropped dark hair going silver at the temples, and the kind of face that had stopped being surprised by anything roughly a decade ago. He was not cruel. That was what made him effective. He sat down across from me, set a manila folder on the table without opening it, and looked at me the way a mechanic looks at a machine that has just been towed into the shop. Not with judgment, just with the weary certainty that he already knows what is wrong. And the paperwork is going to take a long time. "Mr. Navarro," he said, "you have been read your rights. You understand you can stop talking at any point and request an attorney." "I understand. I do not need an attorney. I have not done anything." His nameplate read Salazar. Detective Ray Salazar. I would come to learn that he was good at his job in the precise way that made the first weeks of my life inside the system significantly harder, and the final weeks of this ordeal possible. But sitting across from him at 4:17 in the morning with the taste of desert dust still in my mouth and my son's accusation still ringing in my ears, I did not know any of that yet. Salazar opened the folder slowly. He laid out 3 photographs in a row, evenly spaced, the way a man deals cards when the game is already decided. And the only question left is how long it takes the other player to understand. The first photograph was the crash scene. The Beechcraft broken across the highway under the strobes. I had just seen it with my own eyes, but seeing it reduced to a 4x6 print made it worse somehow. Smaller, more permanent. The second photograph was the wrench in the evidence bag. The snap-on with the dark residue visible on the head. The third photograph I had not expected. It was a wide shot of a residential property on the northeast side of Albuquerque. A modern house set back from a landscaped driveway. Crime scene tape across the front entrance. An Albuquerque Police Department unit parked outside with its lights still turning. "Do you recognize this address?" Salazar asked. "No," I said. "But it looks like the Heights. North Albuquerque. Maybe Sandia Heights area." He tapped the photograph with one finger. "A young woman was found there earlier this evening. Her name was Nina Sandoval. She was 26 years old. She was an energy engineer. Cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head." He paused to let that land. "The tool we recovered from your aircraft tonight is consistent with the wound pattern." The room went very quiet. I could hear the ventilation system running somewhere behind the ceiling tiles. A low mechanical hum that reminded me of the sound a turbine makes when it is spooling down after shutdown. The kind of sound that means the power is still there, somewhere, but the output has stopped. "I have never been to that address," I said. "I did not know Nina Sandoval. I have not left my hangar since 2 in the afternoon." Salazar pulled the folder open further and removed a printed sheet. Single-spaced, several paragraphs long. He slid it across the table and watched my face as I read it. It was the 911 call. Jesse's voice transcribed word for word. "My father has been drinking since this afternoon. He told me he had to go see someone tonight about a problem with the land near the airport. He took the plane, and when he came back, something was wrong. There was blood on his coveralls. He made me help him load something into the aircraft. I think he hurt someone. I think he hurt a woman. I do not know what to do. He told me if I said anything, he would make sure I went down with him. I am scared of what he will do. Please send someone to Interstate 25. Please hurry." I read every line twice. Slowly. The way you read something when part of your brain is refusing to process what the words actually say. Each sentence was precise, measured, the kind of detail that does not come from panic but from preparation. My son had not stammered through a desperate call for help. He had delivered a script. I set the transcript down on the table and placed both palms flat on the surface and breathed. "That is a fabrication," I said. Every sentence of it. Your son sounded genuinely frightened. Mr. Navarro, my son is 27 years old, and he knows exactly how to sound like whatever the moment requires. The words came out harder than I intended. I pulled them back a little. Detective, I can tell you exactly what happened tonight. The Beechcraft was taken from my tarmac without my permission. I discovered it missing at approximately 10:30. I tried to reach both my wife and my son by phone. When I could not, I activated the kill switch on the aircraft. It operates on a separate radio frequency from the GPS system. Independent. Range of about 1 mile. Then I received a call from the scene, and I drove there. That is the complete sequence. Salazar looked at me. Why did you not call us when the aircraft went missing? I had asked myself the same question sitting in that office chair at 10:45. And I gave him the honest answer, because my son's name was the first thing that came to mind. And I wanted to understand what was happening before I made a call that could not be taken back. That was a mistake in judgment. I know how it looks. Salazar seemed to consider that. Then he pulled out one more item. A close-up photograph of the wrench. Dark residue visible on the head, even in the low-resolution print. The tool has your name on the purchase registration, he said. It is my wrench. It came from my shop. I did not put it in that aircraft, and whoever did had access to my building. Before Salazar could respond, the door behind him opened. I looked up expecting another detective. It was Margaret. She was dressed as if she had taken time getting ready. Clean blouse. Hair combed back. She did not look like a woman who had been woken by a crisis. She looked like a woman who had been waiting for a particular moment to arrive and had chosen her clothes accordingly. She sat in the chair beside Salazar. Not beside me. That single choice told me everything about the conversation that was about to happen. Margaret, I said, tell him what you know. Tell him about Jesse. She looked at the table between her hands. Her expression was composed and carefully empty. Ed, she said quietly, I do not know what happened tonight. I was not there. You knew he took the Beechcraft. You told me maybe I forgot where I parked it. Those were your exact words. 30 minutes ago on the phone, she shook her head slowly. Just slightly. As if I had said something she found difficult to hear, but not surprising. I think you have been under a lot of stress, Ed. You have been working every night for weeks. The hours, the pressure. I have been worried about you for a long time. The sound that came out of me was not quite a laugh. You are going to sit in this room and tell a homicide detective that I am confused about my own wife telling me to stand down while our son took my aircraft. She did not answer. She looked at Salazar instead, and I understood then. Fully. With a clarity that felt like something physical. Like a control cable snapping clean inside a fuselage. That she had made her choice before she walked through that door. Whatever she knew, whatever she had been part of, she had decided that protecting Jesse was worth what she was doing to me in this room right now. 33 years of marriage. And she was sitting 18 inches away, turning into a stranger with every second that passed. Salazar cleared his throat. Mr. Navarro, I would strongly advise you to contact an attorney before this conversation continues. I looked at my wife one more time. She was still looking at the table. That is probably right, I said. And I stopped talking. But even as the room went silent around me, one thought kept surfacing through everything else. One detail from the crash scene that no one had mentioned yet. The cargo compartment of the Beechcraft. I had installed a compact halon fire suppression system in that compartment 2 years ago. A racing-grade unit designed to kill a fuel fire within seconds. The compartment had not burned through in the crash. The bag of clothing the officers had recovered from inside it had survived intact. And whatever was inside that bag had not been destroyed the way someone had clearly wanted it to be. I did not say any of this out loud. But I filed it away in the part of my mind that never stops working. The same part that listens to an engine on startup and already knows where the fault is before the diagnostic panel lights up. There was a story in that cargo compartment, and I intended to find out what it told. The door to the Metropolitan Detention Center closed behind me at 8:14 in the morning. It was not a dramatic sound, just a heavy door doing what heavy doors do. But there is a difference between knowing a door can close and standing on the wrong side of it when it shuts. I had been formally charged with first-degree murder, fabrication of evidence, and obstruction of justice. Bail was denied. The prosecutor argued flight risk, and the judge agreed without visible deliberation. I was 52 hours removed from standing in my own hangar, and I was now wearing a county-issued uniform in a cell that smelled of bleach and someone else's despair. 12 days. That was how long I sat on that metal bunk. 12 mornings of fluorescent light flickering on at 6. 12 nights of staring at a ceiling the color of old teeth. By the third morning, the news had reached everywhere it was going to reach. A corrections officer told me, not unkindly, that reporters had been calling. One station had pulled a photograph from my racing years, me standing beside the Staggerwing after the Oshkosh Grand Champion ceremony in 2019, and placed it next to a photograph of Nina Sandoval. The contrast was apparently useful to them. Margaret came on the 10th day. The visitation room was a row of booths separated by reinforced glass, communication through mounted handsets. She was wearing the gray cardigan she always wore when she was trying to feel in control of something. Her face was tired but composed. Not the kind of tired that comes from worry. The kind that comes from maintaining a position. "They are saying it will go to grand jury," she said. "I know. Ed." She stopped. Started again. "If you cooperate, if you work with the prosecutor and explain what happened, they might reduce the charge." That is what Jesse's attorney said. I stared at her through the glass. Jesse has an attorney already. He needed representation. He is a witness, Ed. Margaret. I kept my voice flat. Our son called 911 and told them I killed a woman. He is not a witness. He is the reason I am sitting in this room. Her jaw tightened slightly. "You do not know what happened that night. I know what did not happen. I know I was not at that house. I know I did not touch that girl. And I know that wrench came from my shop, which means someone with access to my building put it in my aircraft. If you want to have an honest conversation about who that someone is, I am right here. But I will not sit across from you and pretend this is a misunderstanding I caused." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I am trying to hold this family together. Ed, there is no family to hold together. There is only the truth, and there is the story Jesse told the police. Those two things cannot both exist at the same time." She set the handset down and left without saying goodbye. I watched her walk out and noticed that her step was steady and her shoulders were straight. And I thought about what it meant that a woman could leave her husband in a detention center and still walk like that. It meant she had made her peace with the decision before she arrived. I was still thinking about that when the corrections officer came back to tell me I had another visitor. Tomas Reyes had worked for me for 10 years. He came to Navarro Aviation at 26 with a Marine Corps discharge, a trade school certificate, and a mechanical instinct that reminded me of myself at that age. 2 tours in Helmand Province, then a decade rebuilding aircraft engines in a quiet hangar on the Mesa. He was 36 now. Stocky. Steady. The kind of man who does not rattle when the thing in front of him cannot be fixed with a wrench. He sat down across from me and put his hands flat on the counter on his side of the glass. He looked at me directly. "I have read everything they published," he said. "I do not believe any of it." "You might be the only one," I said. "Then I will be the only one." He said it without drama, the way he said most things. "Tell me what you need." I told him everything. The GPS relay cut at 10:41. The kill switch activation at 10:47. The halon system in the cargo compartment. The wrench from cabinet 3. The bag of clothing the officers recovered. Margaret's voice on the phone. Jesse's performance on the median. Tomas listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that changed the shape of everything. The kill switch log. The activation command. That is stored on the application server. It carries a timestamp. That is proof you sent the cutoff from a stationary position. You were not in that aircraft. He leaned forward slightly. And the flight data recorder in the Staggerwing. The seat pressure sensor you calibrated for the racing series last year. It logs pilot weight every time the engine cycles. You weigh 205 pounds, boss. Jesse is about 155. I felt something shift in my chest. Not hope exactly. Something more structural than hope. The way a cracked spar feels different from a broken one. A cracked spar can still carry load. There is still something to work with. The seat data would show whoever was in that cockpit, I said. Tomas held my eyes through the scratched glass. Machines do not lie, boss. People do. I looked at this man who had walked into my hangar a decade ago with nothing but ability and integrity, and I felt for the first time since the Beechcraft disappeared something I could build on. A place to start. There is one more thing, Tomas said, and his voice dropped. I went into the hangar yesterday to check on the equipment. Someone had been in there. Tool cabinet number 3. The lock was forced. And the snap-on set. The limited run from 2021. He paused. The wrench is gone. The one they found in your aircraft. That is the one from your cabinet. I already knew that. But hearing him confirm it, hearing the words from someone who had stood in the same room and seen the same empty slot in the same cabinet, made it settle into my bones in a different way. Jesse had gone into my hangar and taken the tool that would later be placed inside my aircraft before the night was over. This was not a crime of impulse. This had been assembled piece by piece, the way you build an airframe. With patience, with foresight, and with the cold understanding of exactly how it would perform when you finally sent it down the runway, the question I could not yet answer. The question that would drive everything that came next was how far back the planning went, and whether the boy I raised was the only one who had been building it. Grace Norris came on the 18th day. That is not her name. Her name was Claire Whitaker, and she walked into the visitation room the way a crosswind hits you on short final, without warning, and with enough force to change your approach entirely. She was around 47. Charcoal blazer over a plain white shirt. No jewelry, except a slim silver watch on her left wrist. She set a leather folder on the counter, pulled out the chair across from me, and sat down with the unhurried confidence of someone who had already decided the outcome before she walked through the door. Claire Whitaker, she said, extending her hand through the gap beneath the glass. Criminal defense. Tomas Reyes called me 6 days ago. He said you would be too proud to ask for help yourself. I shook her hand. He is not wrong. He also told me you built every security system on that aircraft with your own hands. She uncapped a pen and opened the folder. That matters more than you think. Tell me everything. Start from the moment the GPS signal went dark. So I did. I told her about 10:41 on the night of March 15th. The tracking application freezing, the cursor locked over the tarmac, like a held breath. I told her about the kill switch I had built. A custom unit on a dedicated radio frequency, because standard remote systems were too easy to exploit with relay amplifiers. I told her about calling Margaret and getting a voice so flat it made my jaw tighten, about Jesse's phone rolling to voicemail, about activating the kill switch at 10:47 and then receiving the call from the scene, about Jesse's voice, controlled in a way no genuinely panicked person ever manages. I told her about the wrench, about Drucker crouching beside the cockpit door and lifting it from the storage compartment like he was extracting a confession. Claire wrote without interrupting. When I finished, she did not offer reassurance or sympathy. She simply looked up from her notes and said, "Good. Now, let me show you what Tomas found." She reached into the leather folder and produced a sealed evidence bag. Inside was a clump of reddish-orangite soil, the kind specific to the iron-rich mineral corridors of the northern Rio Grande Rift Zone where ancient volcanic sediment bleeds through the desert floor after rain and stains everything it touches the color of dried blood. She placed it on the counter between us with the deliberate care of someone presenting a key piece of a puzzle they had been assembling for days. Tomas pulled this from the landing gear assembly of your Beechcraft before the impound lot restricted access, she said. He documented everything. Time of collection. Precise location on the aircraft. Full written chain of custody. Photographs with timestamps on a separate device. He followed independent evidence collection procedure to the letter, which means this bag has a paper trail that any prosecutor will have difficulty challenging. She let that settle. This soil is from the Rio Rancho corridor, specifically from the unpaved access road that runs behind a private ranch property north of Albuquerque. That road does not appear on any logical flight path between your airfield and the crash site on Interstate 25. There is no incidental reason for that soil to be on your landing gear. The Beechcraft went to that property, I said. Before the crash. Before the crash, Claire confirmed. I have already contacted a forensic geologist at the University of New Mexico. The mineral composition of this sample is distinctive enough to be mapped to that specific road with high scientific confidence. If the lab confirms the match, we have independent physical evidence placing your aircraft at that property on the night of March 15th. Evidence that stands entirely on its own without relying on your credibility as a witness. I stared at that bag of reddish earth. At the dried, crumbling soil that had clung to the belly of my aircraft through an impound lot and a crime scene and 18 days of silence, waiting for the right person to notice it. There is something else, Claire said. Her tone did not change, but something in her eyes did. A careful tightening, the way a person looks when they are about to hand you information they have not fully processed themselves. Tomas inspected your Halen fire suppression system. The unit you installed in the cargo compartment for track use, designed to discharge suppressant if it detects heat signatures consistent with a fuel fire. He found evidence of a partial discharge, not a full trigger, just enough to release a trace amount of chemical agent into the aft wheel well area. I sat up straighter. That is exactly where you would reach if you wanted to access the fuel line without triggering the full system. Yes, Claire said. Someone worked on that aircraft while the Halon system was live. They were careful enough to avoid a full discharge, but not careful enough to eliminate the chemical trace that a partial activation leaves behind. She set her pen down and folded her hands. There is one more thing. The kill switch receiver in your hangar logged 2 radio frequency signals on the night of March 15th. The first arrived at 10:44 in the evening, a frequency that was not yours. Attempting to interface with your system, your activation signal came in at 10:47 and overrode it. She met my eyes. Someone tried to take control of your aircraft before you did, and they transmitted from close range. The room went still. Whoever had taken my Beechcraft had not acted on impulse. They had come prepared with technology built specifically to counter the one system I had trusted most. This was not rage. This was not opportunity. This was engineered. Planned. Deliberate. Claire folded her hands over the evidence bag. Each of these pieces individually is arguable, she said. The soil could be challenged on collection method. The halon residue could be dismissed as mechanical anomaly. The competing radio signal could be attributed to interference. But together, the soil, the halon trace, the kill switch log, they form a pattern. And patterns are what juries remember. For the first time since March 15th, I felt something other than the slow grind of helplessness. It was colder and more focused than hope. It was the feeling I used to get on the starting grid when I had done everything right in the hangar, checked every bolt, balanced every surface, and all that was left was to fly. Then Claire picked up the folder and held it without opening it. She was quiet for just long enough that I knew what came next was going to be different. There is one more question I need to ask you, she said carefully. And I need you to think before you answer. She met my eyes across the counter. Who else knew that kill switch existed? She did not answer for me. The silence that followed told me she had already been sitting with that exact question and that the answer she was forming was one she was not yet ready to say out loud. Claire secured my release on bail on the evening of April 2nd. By 7 the next morning, I was standing inside Hangar 1 at Navarro Aviation for the first time in 20 days. The overhead fluorescents buzzed the same way they always had. The air still carried the faint smell of avgas and hot metal that had lived in these walls for 3 decades. Nothing had changed about the building. Everything had changed about what it meant to stand in it. Tomas was already there, seated in front of 2 monitors in the small climate-controlled room I had converted years ago to house the shop security server and diagnostic archive, a coffee cup at his elbow, a legal pad filled with handwritten notes beside the keyboard. He stood when I walked in, and for a moment neither of us said anything. Then he nodded once, the way men do when the words would take longer than the situation allows. "Show me," I said. He sat back down. The hangar runs 3 exterior cameras, 2 covering the main tarmac, 1 on the rear access gate. The primary footage from the night of March 14th was partially deleted. Not wiped completely, partially. Whoever did it had access to the primary recording directory, but they did not know about the backup. He paused and looked at me. 9 months ago, I installed a secondary recording system on a separate physical drive. Air-gapped. No network connection. No remote access. I did not tell you about it because I did not want anyone to know it existed. I set it up after that break-in attempt last summer. Insurance. The kind you build when you have seen enough people lose things they spent a lifetime putting together. He pulled up the first file. The left monitor filled with security footage. Grainy but functional. Timestamp sharp in the upper corner. March 14th, 2025. 9:15 in the evening. The rear access gate swung open. A figure entered. Lean. Dark clothing. Moving with the unhurried ease of someone entirely comfortable in the space. Not searching. Not hesitant. Familiar. The figure crossed the tarmac, disappeared into Hangar 2 where the tool cabinet stood, and emerged 16 minutes later carrying something small in one hand. Walked back through the gate and pulled it closed. Tomas paused the footage and zoomed toward the frame just before the figure turned from the camera. I did not need the zoom. I had recognized the walk before Tomas touched the mouse. 27 years of watching that particular way of moving. First, as a small boy crossing the tarmac in the morning to bring me a thermos of coffee Margaret had made. Then as a teenager who believed confidence was a substitute for effort. Then as a young man who had quietly decided that everything his father built was beneath him. Jesse. He was here the night before, I said. My voice came out level because I needed it to. If I let the full weight of what I was seeing hit me all at once, I would stop being useful. And right now being useful was the only thing I had left. 16 minutes in the hangar, Tomas said. That is enough time if you know exactly where you are going and you come prepared. He reached into the parts cabinet beside the server rack and set something on the desk. A small circuit board no larger than a deck of playing cards, with a stripped wire lead on one end and 2 surface-mounted components on the other. I found this taped behind the rear seat brace during the undercarriage inspection, he said. It is a programmable radio frequency emitter. The components are available off the shelf, but the assembly is custom. Someone built this specifically to mirror and override your kill switch frequency at a pre-programmed time. I picked it up, turned it over in my hands, felt the surprising lightness of it. A thing this small, carrying this much consequence. This is what sent the competing signal at 10:44, I said. Yes. It was pre-programmed to broadcast at a frequency that would interfere with your remote activation, either prevent you from triggering the kill switch entirely or create a false activation log that would look like operator error on your end. The system was not sophisticated enough to fully override your unit, which is why your signal at 10:47 still connected. But the attempt is logged. Tomas pulled up the second monitor. Columns of flight data recorder information. Timestamps running down the screen in clean rows. That is not the only thing the aircraft recorded. He pointed to a specific cluster of entries. Your Staggerwing's flight data recorder logs. Seat pressure data every time the engine cycles. It is a passive system. Runs automatically as part of the weight and balance protocol you configured for the racing series. He tapped the screen. On the night of March 15th, between 10:34 in the evening and 12:09 in the morning, the seat pressure sensor recorded a continuous pilot weight between 153 and 157 pounds. Claire, who had been standing against the far wall with her arms folded and her eyes moving between the two monitors, spoke without looking away from the screen. Ed, what do you weigh? 205, I said. And Jesse? I already knew. I had known since the moment Tomas said the number. About 155. The flight data sat on the screen. Columns of numbers recorded by a machine in the dark, at altitude, on a night when my aircraft was being used to destroy me. Numbers that had no motive, no loyalty, and no capacity for deception. Claire stepped forward and unfolded her arms. Individually, every one of these elements can be challenged by opposing counsel. The footage is grainy. The weight data carries a margin of error. The emitter could theoretically have been planted after the fact. That is exactly why we do not present them individually. She looked at me directly. We present a corroborating chain. The soil places the aircraft at the ranch property. The halon residue places someone working near the fuel line. The backup footage places Jesse in this hangar the night before. The flight data places a 155-pound pilot behind the controls during the incident window, and the radio frequency emitter accounts for the competing signal in the kill switch log. She paused. Each piece supports the next. A jury does not need certainty from any single element. They need to see a pattern that only resolves one way. I set the circuit board back on the desk. My hands were steady. I had learned on runways where the margin between a good landing and a catastrophe was measured in fractions of a second, that the moment your hands begin to shake is the moment you have already lost. Then Claire's phone buzzed against the metal desk. She picked it up, read the screen, and I watched something shift in her expression. A small controlled tightening around the eyes that only appears when information arrives before you are ready to evaluate what it means. It is Detective Salazar, she said, setting the phone down slowly. He is requesting a meeting tonight. He says his team ran a second sweep of the crash site on Interstate 25 and recovered something that was not included in the original evidence report. She looked up and met my eyes. He did not say what it was. Detective Ray Salazar stepped into Claire's office that evening and the air shifted. He was 53, but carried the weight of 24 years in New Mexico homicide, the way load-bearing structures carry stress. Through the center, silently, without showing the strain until something finally gives, broad through the shoulders. Close-cropped dark hair going silver. Eyes that missed nothing and gave away less. He had a habit of watching your hands when you spoke, not your face. Claire had warned me about that. He carried a manila folder, like it contained the last honest thing left in Bernalillo County. He sat down, opened it, and slid a photograph across the table without greeting anyone first. Second sweep of the Interstate 25 crash site turned up something the first team missed, he said, his eyes settling on me. 12 feet from the point of impact, in the drainage ditch running alongside the shoulder, wrapped in a piece of shop rag. I picked up the photograph. A wrench. Not just any wrench. A snap-on model, with a rubber grip handle. The same brand and series as the one Officer Drucker had pulled from the Beechcraft cockpit on the night of March 15th. But this one had something the first wrench did not. Blood. The lab confirmed human blood on the grip and the lower shaft. Salazar continued, his tone flat and professional. Type O positive. We ran it against the database. It matches a sample from a prior medical intake. Jesse Navarro. Emergency room visit. 2021. He paused, watching my hands the way Claire had told me he would. Your son's blood is on a wrench found at the crash site. The wrench recovered from the aircraft had your prints on it, Mr. Navarro. This one has no identifiable prints at all. Wiped, clean. But the blood is Jesse's. The room stayed quiet for a moment. Claire was already thinking. I could see it in the way she held her pen without writing. How does Jesse's blood end up on a wrench at the crash site if he walked away without a scratch? I said, my voice barely above a whisper. That, Salazar said, is the question I have been sitting with for 3 days. He leaned back in his chair. The official incident report from the night of March 15th states that Jesse Navarro sustained no injuries. Officer Drucker's notes confirm no visible wounds during the roadside interaction. No ambulance was called for the pilot. No medical evaluation was requested or performed. He tapped the photograph. So either that blood was deposited before the crash, meaning the wrench was in the aircraft or on Jesse's person when he flew, or someone placed it in that ditch after the fact. Either way, it contradicts the clean narrative that has been built around your son's account of that night. Claire set her pen down. Her expression was unreadable. Detective Salazar, what is your current read on this case? Salazar looked at her for a long moment. His eyes narrowed slightly. Off the record, she said steadily. My read is that the first responding team closed the scene too fast. His gaze shifted back to me. Drucker's report is thin in places where it should not be thin. I have worked enough crash scenes to know when a site has been managed. When the story on the ground is just a little too tidy for the chaos that is supposed to have produced it. He leaned forward, elbows on the table. I am not saying your son had help from inside the department. I am saying the scene was not treated with the care it deserved. And I want to understand why. That landed differently than I expected. Not the way good news lands. More like the way a hangar door opens onto a runway you were not sure you wanted to use. You are looking at Drucker, I said. The words tasted bitter, even as I spoke them. Salazar did not confirm or deny. He simply closed the folder. What I am doing is following evidence that was overlooked in a first report. That is standard procedure for a secondary sweep. He stood, buttoned his jacket with a practiced motion. What you do with the information I have shared tonight is between you and your attorney. He looked at Claire. I would expect a formal evidence disclosure request within the week. Make sure your forensic documentation on the soil sample and the flight data is airtight. The blood on that second wrench is interesting, but interesting alone does not move a case. He left without shaking hands. The door clicked shut, and Claire and I sat in the quiet of her office with the photograph still on the table between us. He is building something, Claire said finally, her voice low. He did not come here just to share a discovery. He came to see what we have and decide whether it is worth working parallel to. Is that good? I asked. Though I already sensed the answer. It means we are not alone, she said, picking up the photograph and studying it. But it also means Salazar has his own objective, and it may not align perfectly with ours at every step. She slid the photograph back into her copy of the folder. What matters right now is the blood. Jesse's blood on a wiped wrench, 12 feet from the crash site, contradicts every element of his official account. We need to file an independent motion for access to that evidence before the prosecution decides how to characterize it. I nodded. But I was not thinking about the wrench anymore. I was thinking about what Salazar had said. The scene was too tidy. And I was thinking about the night of March 15th, standing on that highway in the dark, watching Officer Kyle Drucker crouch beside the Beechcraft's open cockpit door. How quickly he had found that first wrench. How cleanly he had lifted it, like a man who already knew where to look. I had assumed from the beginning that Jesse had acted alone, that the cruelty had been personal, the particular cruelty of a son who had learned to treat his father's generosity as a resource to be extracted rather than a gift to be valued. But if Drucker had been positioned at that scene before the crash was even called in, if the site had been prepared before I arrived, then this was something larger than a son turning on a father. It was a setup, and I had walked directly into the center of it. I drove home that night with the windows down and the desert air moving through the cab, and I tried to remember every interaction I had ever watched between Jesse and Kyle Drucker. Every moment that might have been a meeting I had not recognized as one. There were more than I wanted to count. Tomas called me on a Tuesday morning, and the first thing he said was not hello. He said, "Boss, I found the company." I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The house was quiet. Margaret had not come home the night before, and I had stopped expecting her to. I pressed the phone against my ear and asked him what he meant. He told me he had started with the RF emitter, the small circuit board someone had taped behind the rear seat brace of my Beechcraft. The chip itself was a commercial component, available from a dozen suppliers. But the board had been assembled by hand, soldered with a specific flux pattern that Tomas recognized from military contract work. He traced the purchase order through 3 forwarding addresses to a company registered in Wilmington, Delaware. The name on the incorporation documents was Solaris Holdings, LLC. I had never heard that name before. Tomas had. He said it had appeared once in a county zoning filing 18 months earlier, attached to a proposal for a 200-acre solar energy installation on the west side of Albuquerque. The proposed site included a narrow corridor of land that ran directly through the eastern boundary of Double Eagle II Airport. My hangar sat on a lease that depended on that boundary remaining unchanged. I set the coffee down and asked him who owned Solaris Holdings. Tomas said the registered agent was a law firm in Delaware that specialized in single-purpose entities. But the operating agreement, which he obtained through a public records request filed by Claire, listed one managing member. His name was Dominic Voss. I knew the name. Everyone in the aviation community west of the Rio Grande knew Dominic Voss. He was 56 years old, a developer who had built his reputation turning rural acreage into commercial projects. Solar farms, distribution warehouses, data centers. He had a ranch north of Rio Rancho where he hosted fundraisers for county commissioners and invited FAA regional liaisons to hunting weekends. He was the kind of man who never appeared on a deed himself, but whose initials were written on every napkin where a deal began. Tomas continued. He had pulled Jesse's bank records through a subpoena Claire filed under the fraud investigation statute. For 37 months, Jesse had received a recurring wire transfer of $800 on the first of every month. The transfers originated from a commercial account held by Solaris Holdings at a bank in Las Cruces. 37 months. That meant the payments had started more than 3 years before the crash, before Jesse had come back to Albuquerque, before he had walked into my hangar and asked me for a second chance. I felt something shift inside my chest. Not anger exactly. Something heavier. The realization that this had not started the night my plane went down on Interstate 25. It had started years earlier, in a quiet room I was never invited into, with a handshake I never saw. Claire arrived at the hangar that afternoon, with a printed spreadsheet and a yellow legal pad covered in her handwriting. She spread the documents across the workbench, where I usually laid out engine gaskets, and told me what the financial trail revealed. Solaris Holdings had made a total of 114 payments across 4 recipients. Jesse received the monthly transfers totaling $29,600. Officer Kyle Drucker received a single lump sum of $22,000, deposited 3 weeks before the crash into a savings account he had opened under his middle name. A third recipient was a consulting firm called Redstone Advisory Group, which Claire said was another shell entity registered to the same Delaware agent. She had not yet identified who controlled Redstone, but the payments to it totaled over $60,000. The fourth recipient was someone I had shared a bed with for 33 years. Margaret Navarro had received 21 separate transfers, totaling $47,000. The first deposit arrived 16 months before the crash. The last one cleared 4 days after I was arrested. Claire watched my face when she told me. She did not soften the number or explain it away. She simply placed the printout on the workbench and let me read the dates myself. Each transfer was between $1,800 and $2,500, small enough to avoid automatic reporting thresholds, consistent enough to resemble a payroll. I picked up the page and held it under the fluorescent light. Margaret's name was right there, printed beside a routing number I did not recognize. 16 months. She had been receiving money from the man who wanted to take my airfield while she stood in our kitchen and told me Jessie just needed time, while she drove to the detention center and whispered through the glass that I should cooperate, while she sat next to Detective Salazar and shook her head like a woman who simply could not understand what her husband had become. Tomas leaned against the tool cabinet and said nothing. Claire closed her legal pad and looked at me with steady eyes. I asked her what this meant legally. She said it meant we now had a documented financial connection between Dominic Voss, my son, my wife, and a law enforcement officer involved in my arrest. She said it did not yet prove conspiracy to commit murder, but it established a pattern of coordinated payments that any prosecutor would recognize as a framework for coercion and obstruction. She said the next step was to trace Redstone Advisory Group and determine whether Voss had additional contacts inside the department or the district attorney's office. She also said we needed to move carefully, because the moment Voss learned we had his financial records, the remaining evidence would begin to disappear. I looked at the spreadsheet one more time. 37 months of payments to my son, 16 months of payments to my wife, a lump sum to the officer who had arrived at the crash site 13 minutes before anyone called him, and somewhere behind all of it, a man with a ranch and a solar farm plan, and the patience to spend 3 years building a trap around a 63-year-old mechanic who had never wanted anything except to keep his hangar and fly his airplane. I folded the spreadsheet and placed it inside the breast pocket of my coveralls, right next to the pen I used to sign inspection logs. Claire picked up her phone and said she needed to call Salazar before the end of the day. She said there was something else she had not mentioned yet. Something Tomas had found in the backup camera footage that did not involve Jessie at all. She looked at me and said, "Ed, have you ever seen your wife visit the hangar after midnight?" Claire pulled the footage up on Tomas's second monitor, the one connected to the air-gapped backup system that nobody but Tomas knew existed. The timestamp read March 3, 12 days before the crash. At 12:47 in the morning, a figure appeared at the rear gate of the hangar compound. The gate required a 4-digit code, and the figure entered it without hesitation. She walked across the apron with her head down and her hands in the pockets of a long coat I recognized because I had bought it for her on our 30th anniversary. Margaret moved through Hangar 2 like someone who had been there before. She did not stop to look around. She did not use a flashlight. She went directly to the maintenance office at the back wall, opened the filing cabinet beside my desk, and removed a single folder. She stood there for almost 4 minutes, reading or photographing the contents. Then she replaced the folder, closed the cabinet, and walked back out the way she had come. The entire visit lasted 6 minutes and 20 seconds. I asked Claire what was in that cabinet. She said she did not know yet, but she had already asked Tomas to inventory every document inside it. I knew what was there. I kept my lease agreements in that cabinet, along with the original survey maps of the airfield boundary, the FAA compliance records, and the insurance policy for the Beechcraft. If someone wanted to understand exactly how to dismantle Navarro Aviation from the inside, that cabinet was the place to start. Claire told me she had contacted Sandra Fenn, a forensic accountant she had worked with on 3 previous cases. Sandra had already reviewed the Solaris Holdings payment records and confirmed the 21 transfers to Margaret. But Sandra had also found something Claire had not expected. Margaret maintained a second checking account at a credit union in Santa Fe, opened 14 months earlier under her maiden name, Margaret Lucero. The account had received deposits matching the Solaris transfers within 48 hours of each one. It had also made 6 outgoing payments to a prepaid phone service, the kind that sold disposable numbers in monthly blocks. I asked Claire if she knew what those phone numbers were used for. She said Sandra was working on it, but one of the numbers had already appeared in a cellular tower log that Salazar had obtained during the initial investigation. It had pinged a tower near the Rio Rancho Ranch at 11:18 on the night of the crash, 41 minutes before the GPS relay on my Beechcraft went dark. Claire set her pen down and looked at me across the workbench. She said she needed to ask me a direct question. She asked when Margaret had first learned about the kill switch. I told her the truth. Margaret had known about the kill switch since the day I built it. I had designed the system 7 years earlier, after a rash of aircraft thefts at smaller airfields in the valley. I built it in the hangar with Tomas, tested it on a Saturday afternoon while Margaret sat on a lawn chair near the taxiway reading a magazine. She had watched me activate and deactivate it a dozen times. She knew the frequency. She knew the range. And she knew where I kept the bypass code taped inside tool cabinet 3. Claire wrote something on her legal pad and circled it twice. She asked if Margaret had ever discussed the kill switch with anyone outside the family. I said I did not think so, but I could not be certain. Claire said that was the problem. If Margaret had shared the technical details with Voss or with anyone connected to Solaris Holdings, it would explain how the custom RF emitter had been built to match my frequency. Whoever constructed that device had not guessed the specifications. They had known them. I sat there in my own hangar, surrounded by tools I had collected over 36 years, and tried to understand the shape of what had been done to me. My wife had visited this building in the middle of the night to photograph my lease documents. She had received $47,000 from the man who wanted my land. She had maintained a secret bank account and a disposable phone that placed her in contact with the Rio Rancho area on the night my aircraft was stolen and crashed onto a highway. Tomas was standing near the door with his arms folded. He had not spoken in several minutes. When I looked at him, he simply nodded once, the way he did when we finished a long inspection, and everything checked out except one component that needed replacing. Claire said she wanted to bring this information to Salazar within 48 hours. She said the financial records, the footage, and the phone logs together established Margaret as an active participant rather than a passive bystander. She said the question was no longer whether Margaret had known about the conspiracy. The question was whether she had helped design it. Before she left, Claire told me one more thing. Sandra Fenn had traced the 6 prepaid phone numbers to their activation dates. The earliest one had been purchased 19 months before the crash, 5 months before Margaret began receiving payments from Solaris Holdings, 5 months before Jesse came home to Albuquerque and asked me for a job. Someone had started planning before the money began. And the phone had been purchased at a convenience store in Rio Rancho, 3 miles from Dominic Voss's ranch. Claire gathered her folder and told me not to contact Margaret under any circumstances. She said, anything I said to my wife from this point forward could be used to compromise the investigation. I told her I understood. She paused at the hangar door and said, Ed, I know this is not the kind of work you trained for, but you are building a case the same way you build an engine, one verified part at a time. I stayed in the hangar until the sun went down. I did not turn on any additional lights. I sat in the chair beside my workbench and listened to the wind cross the mesa outside, carrying sand against the metal walls in a sound that resembled static on a frequency no one was transmitting on anymore. Claire and I met Detective Salazar at a diner on Central Avenue 3 blocks from the Bernalillo County Courthouse. It was 7:15 in the morning, and the place smelled like burned coffee and bacon grease. Salazar was already seated in a booth near the back wall with a manila folder and a department-issued tablet propped against the napkin dispenser. He looked like a man who had not slept well in several days. Claire placed her own folder on the table and opened it before either of us had ordered. She told Salazar she was ready to present the full evidentiary chain and asked him to confirm whether the district attorney's office had agreed to review the case. Salazar nodded slowly and said he had spoken to DA Claudia Vega the previous afternoon. Vega had reviewed the initial summary and agreed to a formal meeting scheduled for 10 o'clock that morning. He said Vega was cautious but interested. He also said she had asked a question that bothered him. She had asked whether Ed Navarro had any financial motive to fabricate evidence against his own family. I started to respond, but Claire placed her hand flat on the table between us, a gesture I had learned meant silence. She told Salazar that the evidence spoke for itself and that the meeting with Vega would address motive from every direction. Claire then walked Salazar through the 7 primary pieces of evidence in the order she intended to present them. First, the flight data recorder showing a pilot weight between 153 and 157 pounds, inconsistent with my 205. Second, the air-gapped backup footage of Jesse entering the hangar at 21:15 on March 14th and remaining for 16 minutes. Third, the custom RF emitter recovered from behind the rear seat brace, programmed to broadcast at 22:44, 3 minutes before my kill switch activation. Fourth, the soil analysis matching iron-rich sediment from the Rio Rancho corridor to residue on the landing gear assembly. Fifth, the second snap-on wrench recovered from the I-25 crash site, bearing Jesse's blood type. Sixth, the Solaris Holdings financial records documenting payments to Jesse, Margaret, and Officer Kyle Drucker. Seventh, the backup camera footage of Margaret entering the hangar at 12:47 on March 3rd and accessing the filing cabinet containing lease and survey documents. Salazar listened without interrupting. When Claire finished, he turned the tablet toward us and showed a Departmental Internal Affairs flag that had been placed on Officer Drucker's personnel file 2 days earlier. He said a senior lieutenant had reviewed the GPS discrepancy showing Drucker at the crash site 13 minutes before dispatch and had initiated a formal review. Drucker had been placed on administrative leave effective that morning. Salazar said Drucker had not been told the specific reason, only that his movements on the night of March 15th were under examination. Claire asked Salazar whether the IA investigation could compromise the timeline for presenting our evidence to Vega. Salazar said it could, but only if Drucker retained a lawyer who filed a motion to seal his personnel records. He said we had a window of about 72 hours before that became likely. I spoke for the first time and told Salazar something I had not yet told Claire. 3 weeks before the crash, Jesse had come to the hangar on a Sunday afternoon while Tomas was away. He had asked me about the kill switch. Not casually. He had asked specific questions. What frequency it operated on. What the effective range was. Whether it could be overridden by a stronger signal on the same band. I had answered every question because he was my son and I had no reason not to. I told him the frequency. I told him the range was approximately 1 mile under clear conditions. I told him that any signal stronger than mine on the same frequency could theoretically interfere with the command. Claire closed her eyes for a moment and then wrote something on her legal pad. She asked me why I had not mentioned this before. I told her the truth. I had not wanted it to be relevant. I had spent weeks hoping there was an explanation that did not require my son to have planned this from the beginning. But the financial records had ended that hope. If Jesse had been receiving money from Solaris Holdings for 37 months, then his Sunday visit to ask about the kill switch was not curiosity, it was reconnaissance. Salazar checked his watch and said we needed to leave for the courthouse. He told me I would not be present in the meeting with Vega. Only Claire and Salazar would attend, and I would wait in the corridor. He said Vega needed to evaluate the evidence without the emotional variable of the accused sitting in the room. I understood. I had spent 36 years building engines that other people flew. I was accustomed to trusting the machine after it left my hands. We drove separately. I parked in the public lot behind the courthouse and sat in my truck for a few minutes before going inside. The Sandia Mountains were visible to the east, lit pink by the morning sun the way they always are in early spring. I had looked at those mountains 10,000 times from the apron of my hangar while waiting for an engine to warm up. They had never changed. Everything else had. Claire and Salazar entered Vega's office at 9:58. I sat on a wooden bench in the second-floor corridor and watched clerks and attorneys pass in both directions. The meeting lasted 1 hour and 40 minutes. When Claire came out, she was not smiling, but her eyes were steady and her stride was deliberate. She sat beside me on the bench and said 4 words. She is opening a parallel investigation. Drucker first, then Voss. She told me Vega had examined every piece of evidence and found the financial trail the most compelling element. Vega had authorized a subpoena for 36 months of transaction records from Solaris Holdings and instructed her office to coordinate with the State Attorney General on the Drucker matter. She had also told Claire to prepare Ed Navarro for the possibility that Margaret would be called as a material witness within the month. Claire looked at me and said, "Ed, do not go home tonight. Do not call her. Do not send a message. From this moment, anything you say to Margaret is a liability." I nodded. I asked Claire where I should go. She said Tomas had already offered the spare room at his apartment near the airfield. She said it was close to the hangar and far from anyone who might be watching. I stood up from the bench, walked down the courthouse stairs, and drove west toward Double Eagle 2. The Sandias shrank in my rearview mirror until they were just a thin pink line behind everything I was leaving behind. The courtroom smelled like old wood polish and recycled air. I sat in the third row behind the defense table, wearing the only clean shirt I had at Tomas's apartment, a pale blue button-down that Margaret had ironed for me once and that I had never thought to iron myself. Claire sat at the table with her back straight, and her folder centered in front of her like a flight manual before departure. Detective Salazar was 2 rows behind me in a dark jacket, watching the room the way a man watches a runway when the crosswind is unpredictable. Judge Arthur Montoya entered at 10:07. He was in his late 60s with silver hair combed flat and reading glasses that he placed on the bench like surgical instruments. He reviewed the docket number aloud, read the names of the parties, and asked Claire to state the purpose of the motion. Claire stood and said she was filing a motion to dismiss all charges against Edward James Navarro on the grounds of fabricated evidence, coordinated financial conspiracy, and obstruction of justice by parties including the original complainant. She said the defense had compiled 7 independent evidentiary elements and was prepared to present them for judicial review. The assistant district attorney, a woman named Linda Correa, whom I had never seen before, rose and objected immediately. She said the state's case was based on physical evidence recovered at the crash site, a sworn 911 transcript, and witness testimony. She said the defense's claims of conspiracy were speculative and unsupported by verified forensic analysis. Judge Montoya looked at both attorneys over his glasses and said he would hear the evidence before ruling on anything. He told Claire to proceed. Claire began with the flight data recorder. She presented the seat pressure sensor readings showing a pilot weight between 153 and 157 pounds on the night of March 15th. She stated for the record that Ed Navarro weighed 205 pounds at his most recent FAA medical examination, and that Jesse Navarro's estimated weight, based on his last known medical record, was 155 pounds. She placed the printout into evidence as Exhibit 1. She moved to the second snap-on wrench. She explained that it had been recovered 12 feet from the primary crash site during a secondary sweep conducted by Detective Salazar's team. The wrench bore traces of human blood typed as O positive, consistent with Jesse Navarro's blood type recorded during a 2021 emergency room visit. She entered the lab report as Exhibit 2 and added that an independent pathologist had examined the oxidation pattern of the blood and determined it had been deposited on the wrench approximately 3 hours before the crash, not during the impact itself. Correa objected again. She said the blood typing was not a DNA match, and that oxidation dating was an unreliable methodology. Judge Montoya noted the objection and allowed Claire to continue. Claire then presented the financial records. She projected a summary chart showing the payment history from Solaris Holdings LLC to 4 recipients. Jesse Navarro, 37 monthly payments totaling $29,600. Margaret Navarro, 21 transfers totaling $47,000. Officer Kyle Drucker, 1 lump sum of $22,000, deposited 3 weeks before the crash. Redstone Advisory Group, cumulative payments exceeding $60,000. She entered the full banking records as Exhibit 3 and stated that forensic accountant Sandra Fenn had verified every transaction through source documentation obtained via subpoena. The courtroom was silent. I could hear the ventilation system cycling somewhere above the ceiling tiles. Judge Montoya removed his glasses, cleaned them with a cloth, and asked Correa whether the state had been aware of these financial connections prior to today. Correa paused for several seconds and said the state had not independently investigated the financial background of the complainant's family. Claire requested a subpoena for 36 months of complete financial records from Solaris Holdings, including all subsidiary accounts and associated shell entities. She also requested that Margaret Navarro's secondary account at the Santa Fe Credit Union held under the name Margaret Lucero, be included in the disclosure order. Correa opposed the scope, calling it a fishing expedition. Judge Montoya ruled. He granted a partial subpoena, covering 36 months of transaction records for Margaret Navarro and Officer Kyle Drucker from all identified accounts. He deferred the broader Solaris Holdings subpoena pending further review, but instructed Claire to submit a supplemental filing within 14 days. He denied the motion to dismiss at this stage, stating that the evidence was substantial but required full adjudication through trial proceedings. He set a preliminary hearing date for May 19th. He then addressed the courtroom directly. He said that the allegations of law enforcement involvement were serious and that he had been informed of the internal affairs review of Officer Drucker. He ordered that Drucker have no contact with any party to the case and issued a protective order for Ed Navarro, prohibiting Margaret Navarro from approaching within 500 feet of the hangar, the airfield, or Tomas Reyes' residence. When the session ended, Claire gathered her documents and walked beside me into the corridor. She told me the partial subpoena was a significant victory because it forced disclosure of the financial relationship between Margaret and Voss's network. She said the denied dismissal was expected at this stage, and that Montoya had signaled his seriousness by issuing the protective order without being asked. Salazar met us at the elevator and said two things. First, Drucker had retained a private attorney as of that morning. Second, Dominic Voss had left his Rio Rancho ranch 48 hours earlier, and no one in the department knew where he was. Claire looked at Salazar and then at me. She said, "When a man like Voss disappears, it means he is either running or preparing. Either way, we need to move faster." Jesse came to see me on a Thursday evening, 6 days after the hearing. He did not call ahead. I was sitting in Tomas's kitchen eating a sandwich I had made from whatever was in the refrigerator when someone knocked on the front door 3 times, slow and even, the way a person knocks when they are not sure they want the door to open. Tomas answered. I heard Jesse's voice in the hallway, low and uncertain, asking if I was there. Tomas looked back at me and I nodded. Jesse walked into the kitchen and stood near the counter with his hands in the pockets of a denim jacket I had not seen before. He looked thinner than the last time I had seen him, at the crash site, under the silver blanket. His eyes moved across the room like he was cataloging exits. I did not stand up. I did not offer him a chair. I waited. He said, "Dad, I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you say anything." I set the sandwich down and folded my hands on the table. He took a breath that seemed to pull from somewhere deeper than his lungs. Jesse told me he had met Dominic Voss for the first time 3.5 years ago at a bar in Las Cruces. He had been working at a used car lot and falling behind on rent. Voss had introduced himself as a consultant who helped young people with business opportunities. He had bought Jesse dinner and asked questions about his family, his skills, where he had grown up. Jesse said he did not think much of it at the time. A week later, Voss called him and offered him a monthly retainer for what he described as research work. $800 to gather information about commercial properties in the Albuquerque metro area, including airfield leases, zoning boundaries, and development restrictions. Jesse said the first year was exactly that. He would drive to county offices, pull public records, photograph boundary markers, and send the files to an email address Voss gave him. He never met Voss in person again during that period. The money came through a wire transfer on the 1st of every month from an account he later learned belonged to Solaris Holdings. Then, 18 months ago, the nature of the work changed. Voss called Jesse directly for the first time in over a year and told him he needed detailed information about Navarro Aviation, not public records. Private information, the layout of the hangar, the security systems, the terms of the lease, and the specific capabilities of the aircraft. Voss told Jesse, the easiest way to get this information was to go home. Jesse paused and looked at the floor. He said that was when he drove to Albuquerque and showed up at the hangar asking me for a second chance. He said the words he used that day, the apology, the promise to work hard, the mention of wanting to learn the business, were phrases Voss had coached him to say during a phone call the night before. I felt something crack behind my sternum. Not because I was surprised, because I remembered that afternoon perfectly. Jesse standing in the hangar doorway with the light behind him, looking young and uncertain, saying he wanted to make things right. I had believed every word. I had given him a set of keys the next morning. Jesse continued. He said Voss had never told him what the endgame was. He was told only that the information was for a development proposal that would benefit the area and that Ed Navarro would eventually be compensated. But 3 weeks before the crash, Voss called Jesse and told him the timeline had accelerated. He said there was a problem with the lease negotiation and that they needed to create a situation that would force Ed to give up the airfield. Voss told Jesse about the kill switch. He told him the frequency. He told him exactly what to do. I asked Jesse how Voss knew the frequency. Jesse swallowed hard and said, Mom told him. The kitchen was quiet except for the hum of Tomas's refrigerator. I looked at my son and tried to see the boy who had once sat on my workbench in the hangar and handed me wrenches while I explained the difference between a Continental and a Lycoming engine. That boy was somewhere inside the man standing in front of me, buried under 3 years of someone else's architecture. Jesse said Voss had told him the plan was simple. Fly the Beechcraft to the Rio Rancho property. Land on a dirt strip behind the ranch. Leave the aircraft there for recovery later. The crash was not supposed to happen. The RF emitter was supposed to block my kill switch long enough for Jesse to complete the flight, but when my signal overpowered the emitter at 2247, the engine died mid-air and Jesse had no choice but to attempt an emergency landing on the interstate. The collision with the patrol car was an accident. The 911 call blaming me was not. Jesse said Voss had called him 40 minutes after the crash and told him exactly what to say. He said Voss had warned him that if he deviated from the script, the payments to Margaret would be exposed and the entire family would be destroyed. Jesse said he had believed Voss because by then Voss had given him almost $30,000, and Jesse knew that paper trail was enough to implicate him in anything Voss wanted. I asked Jesse one question. I asked him if Nina Sandoval was real. He looked at me and his eyes filled with water for the first time since he had walked in. He said he did not know anyone named Nina Sandoval. He said Voss had given him that name on the phone and told him to use it in the 911 call. He said he had no idea whether the person existed or whether Voss had invented her to add weight to the accusation. I sat with that for a long time. My son had not killed anyone. He had been used as a tool by a man who built traps the way other people built houses, with permits and schedules and budgets, and an exit strategy for everyone except the people living inside. Tomas stepped into the kitchen and said Claire was on the phone. He said she needed to speak with both of us immediately. He said something had happened to Voss. Claire's voice on the phone was controlled but urgent. She told me not to leave Tomas's apartment and to keep Jesse there as well. She said Judge Montoya had scheduled an emergency session for 9 o'clock the following morning and that our presence was required. She said she would explain everything when she arrived. She came to the apartment within the hour, carrying her leather folder and a sealed envelope she had received by courier 30 minutes earlier. She sat at Tomas's kitchen table and opened the envelope with a pocket knife from the drawer. Inside was a certified copy of a subpoena return from the Bernalillo County Clerk's office. Judge Montoya had granted the full subpoena for 36 months of Solaris Holdings financial records, reversing his earlier deferral. Claire said something had changed between the hearing and tonight, and she believed it was connected to Voss's disappearance. She told us what she knew. Dominic Voss had not returned to his Rio Rancho ranch. His personal vehicle, a black Cadillac Escalade, had been found parked at the Albuquerque Sunport long-term lot with the keys locked inside. A one-way ticket to Mexico City had been purchased under his name 3 days earlier, but airline records showed the seat was never occupied. Salazar's team had contacted federal authorities, and a preliminary flag had been placed with Customs and Border Protection. No crossing had been recorded under Voss's name or known aliases. Jesse sat across the table from Claire, with his hands wrapped around a glass of water he had not touched. He looked at me once, and then looked away. I understood. The man who had controlled his life for 3.5 years was now unaccounted for. And Jesse did not know whether to feel relief or fear. The next morning I put on the same blue shirt and drove with Claire to the courthouse. Tomas stayed at the apartment with Jesse, who Claire had instructed not to appear in public until she had arranged a formal proffer agreement with the district attorney's office. She said Jesse's testimony was the most valuable asset we had, and she was not going to let it surface without legal protection. Judge Montoya entered the courtroom at 9:03. He looked the same as before except for a slight tension in his jaw that I had not noticed at the first hearing. ADA Linda Correa was at the prosecution table with a younger attorney I did not recognize. Claire sat at the defense table with her folder open and her pen already in her hand. Montoya addressed both parties and said he had reviewed supplemental filings submitted by Claire and by the district attorney's office in the preceding 72 hours. He said he had also received a communication from the state attorney general's office regarding the internal affairs investigation of Officer Kyle Drucker. He said the matter before the court had expanded beyond the scope of the original charges and that he intended to address several issues in sequence. He began with the subpoena. He confirmed that the full 36-month financial disclosure order for Solaris Holdings LLC and all associated entities had been granted. He directed Solaris's registered agent in Delaware to produce the records within 21 days or face contempt proceedings. He also extended the subpoena to include Redstone Advisory Group, the shell entity Sandra Fenn had identified in the payment chain. He then addressed the protective order. He expanded it to include Jesse Navarro, stating that the court had been made aware of potential witness intimidation and that both Ed and Jesse Navarro were now covered under the 500-foot restriction regarding Margaret Navarro. He also issued a separate no-contact order between Officer Drucker and any party or witness in the case, effective immediately. Correa stood and requested the court's attention. She said the state wished to inform the court that Officer Kyle Drucker had been formally arrested the previous evening on charges of evidence tampering and obstruction of justice. She said Drucker's GPS records, financial disclosures, and testimony from a fellow officer had provided sufficient probable cause. She said the state was cooperating with the defense on this matter, and that Drucker's arrest did not constitute an admission regarding the broader allegations against Ed Navarro. Judge Montoya acknowledged the arrest and asked Claire whether the defense had additional motions. Claire stood and said she had one. She requested that the court compel the district attorney's office to disclose any communications between Dominic Voss and any member of law enforcement, the County Planning Commission, or the FAA regional office within the preceding 48 months. She said the evidence pattern suggested a coordinated land acquisition scheme that extended beyond the framing of her client. Correa objected on grounds of scope. Montoya overruled the objection and granted the request, limiting the disclosure to communications directly referencing Navarro Aviation, Double Eagle II Airport, or Solaris Holdings. Montoya removed his glasses and addressed the courtroom. He said the case before him had begun as a homicide charge and had evolved into an investigation involving financial fraud, evidence tampering, law enforcement corruption, and potential federal land use violations. He said he was referring the matter to a grand jury for independent review and instructed both parties to prepare their evidence for presentation within 30 days. Then he looked at me. Not at Claire, not at Correa. At me. He said, "Mr. Navarro, this court takes the integrity of its proceedings seriously. You will have your hearing." Mr. Navarro. Claire and I walked out of the courthouse into the spring morning. The air was dry and warm and smelled like juniper. She told me the grand jury referral was significant because it removed the case from the narrow frame of a homicide prosecution and opened it to the full scope of the conspiracy. She stopped walking at the edge of the parking lot and said there was one more thing. Salazar had called her during the session. His team had received an anonymous package at the district office that morning. Inside was a portable hard drive and a handwritten note that read, "He kept everything." Claire looked at me and said, "If that drive contains what I think it contains, Dominic Voss just lost the only thing he ever truly protected." The hard drive sat on Claire's desk for 2 days before the forensic technician she trusted was available to examine it. His name was Dean Ochoa, a former FBI digital analyst who now worked independently out of a small office near Old Town. Claire told me Dean had testified in 11 federal cases and had never had a piece of evidence he authenticated successfully challenged on appeal. She said if the drive was genuine, Dean would confirm it. If it had been tampered with, Dean would know that too. On the second evening, Claire called me and said the drive was clean. No malware. No encryption traps. The contents were organized into 4 folders, each labeled in a naming convention that matched corporate filing standards. The first folder was titled Solaris_Payments. It contained 147 transaction records spanning 42 months, including every payment to Jesse, Margaret, Drucker, and Redstone Advisory Group, plus 11 additional recipients Claire had never seen before. 3 of those recipients were listed under names that matched current employees of the Bernalillo County Planning Commission. The second folder was titled Development_Correspondence. Inside were 206 emails between Voss and a network of attorneys, surveyors, and political contacts stretching from Albuquerque to Santa Fe. The emails detailed a phased plan to acquire 7 parcels along the West Mesa corridor, consolidate them under a single zoning variance, and convert the area into a mixed-use solar and commercial development. The plan required the removal of 3 existing leaseholders. Navarro Aviation was listed as the primary obstruction, described in one email as the last anchor that needs to be pulled. The third folder was titled Police_Contacts. It contained 6 recorded phone conversations between Voss and Officer Kyle Drucker, time-stamped over a 14-month period. Claire said she had listened to 2 of them. In the first, Voss instructed Drucker on how to position himself near the I-25 corridor on the night of the planned flight. In the second, recorded 9 days before the crash, Voss discussed the placement of the snap-on wrench and told Drucker where to find it inside the cockpit after the aircraft came to rest. The fourth folder was titled Navarro_Fall. It contained a single document, 11 pages long, written in outline format. The document described a step-by-step strategy to frame Ed Navarro for a violent crime, discredit his FAA certifications, force the termination of his airfield lease, and acquire the property through a foreclosure action initiated by a lender Voss controlled. The outline included timelines, contingency plans, and a section titled Family Leverage that detailed how Margaret and Jesse would be recruited, compensated, and managed. Claire read me the last line of that document over the phone. It said, "Once the airfield is cleared, Solaris proceeds to Phase 2. Navarro does not recover." I was standing in Tomas's living room when she told me this. The window was open, and I could hear a small aircraft taking off from Double Eagle 2, the sound of a single engine climbing through the evening air. I had heard that sound 10,000 times. It had always meant someone was going somewhere. That night, it sounded like something leaving that would not come back. Claire said she was meeting Salazar in the morning to prepare the grand jury presentation. She said the hard drive alone was sufficient to indict Voss on conspiracy, fraud, bribery of a public official, and obstruction. She said the grand jury session was scheduled for the following Monday. I did not sleep much that night. At 6:14 in the morning, my phone rang. It was not Claire. It was Jesse. His voice was a whisper. He said, "Dad, someone is in the apartment." I asked him where Tomas was. He said Tomas had left for the hangar at 5:30 and he was alone. He said he heard the front door open 10 minutes ago and footsteps in the hallway. He said he was in the bedroom with the door locked and the window was too small to climb through. I told him to stay quiet and call 911. I was already putting on my boots. Jesse said, "Dad, there is a camera pointed at me." I heard a sound on his end that I could not identify. A short mechanical click, followed by a low voice I did not recognize, saying, "Hang up." The line went dead. I called Claire. She answered on the second ring, and I told her what Jesse had said. She told me not to go to the apartment. She said she would call Salazar and dispatch patrol units. I told her I understood, and then I got in my truck and drove there anyway. When I arrived, the front door of Tomas's apartment was open. The hallway light was on. I walked inside and found the bedroom door standing open, the lock forced from the outside. The room was empty. Jesse's phone was on the floor beside the bed. The screen cracked. On the mattress was a printed photograph of Jesse sitting in that same room, taken from an angle that suggested a camera mounted near the ceiling vent. On the back of the photograph, someone had written in blue ink, "Come alone to the hangar or your son disappears. You have 90 minutes." I stood in that room holding the photograph and felt my hands shake for the first time since this began. Not from fear for myself, from the understanding that the man who had written an 11-page plan to destroy my life had now taken the one thing I would cross any line to protect. I put the photograph in my pocket and drove toward Double Eagle 2. I did not call Claire. I did not call Salazar. I knew what they would tell me, and I knew I would not listen. The sun was just clearing the Sandias when I pulled onto the access road. The hangar was ahead of me, its metal walls catching the first light the way they had every morning for 36 years. Whatever was waiting inside, it was waiting in a place I had built with my own hands. And that, I decided, was the only advantage I needed. I parked the truck 50 yards from the hangar and cut the engine. The access road was empty. No other vehicles. No movement along the taxiway. The windsock on the near end of the runway hung limp in the still morning air, which meant no crosswind, which meant whatever was about to happen would happen in silence. I walked toward the main door of Hangar 2, the one I had installed myself 29 years ago, when the original rollers failed during a dust storm. I knew every bolt in that door. I knew the gap at the bottom left corner where the frame had settled a quarter-inch over the decades. I knew the sound it made when it opened. A low groan, followed by a metallic click at the halfway point, where the upper track bent slightly inward. I pulled the door open and heard both sounds exactly as I expected. Inside, the fluorescent lights were already on. Someone had turned them on before I arrived. Jesse was sitting in a metal folding chair near the center of the hangar floor, directly beneath the overhead hoist I used for engine lifts. His wrists were fastened to the armrests with black zip ties. A strip of duct tape covered his mouth. His eyes were wide and moving fast, tracking something behind me. I turned around. A man I had never seen in person stood just inside the side entrance of the hangar. He was holding a phone in one hand and nothing in the other. He was tall, mid-50s, wearing a tan jacket over a dark shirt. His shoes were wrong for this environment. Polished leather on a concrete floor dusted with metal shavings and hydraulic residue. He looked like a man who had entered a space he had only ever seen in photographs. He said, "Mr. Navarro, my name is not important. What is important is that you understand the situation clearly." I said nothing. I looked at Jesse. His breathing was fast, but steady. No visible injuries. The chair was positioned precisely beneath the hoist, which told me whoever had set this up did not understand what that hoist was rated for or how the release lever worked. I did. The man told me he was acting on behalf of an interested party who wished to resolve the current legal matter without further public exposure. He said the terms were simple. I would sign a voluntary surrender of my airfield lease, effective immediately. I would withdraw all evidence submissions to the grand jury through my attorney. I would instruct my son to recant his recent statements. In exchange, Jesse would be released unharmed. All financial records linking my family to Solaris Holdings would be destroyed, and the interested party would relocate permanently outside the United States. I asked him where Voss was. He did not answer the question. He held up the phone and said, "You have 15 minutes to decide. After that, your son leaves this hangar in a way you will not be able to repair." I looked around my hangar. I looked at the workbench where Claire had spread her financial documents. I looked at tool cabinet 3, its lock still broken from when Jesse had forced it open to steal the wrench. I looked at the Beechcraft's empty space on the hangar floor. a rectangle of clean concrete where the wheels had rested for 15 years. Now, just a ghost of an outline, surrounded by oil stains and scuff marks. Then I looked up at the ceiling, at the small dark shape mounted near the ventilation duct above the hoist. Tomas's backup camera. The one nobody knew about except Tomas and me. Its tiny red indicator light was off, which meant it was recording. Tomas had designed it that way. The light turned off when the system was active, the opposite of what anyone would expect. I had asked him once why he did it backwards. He said, "Because the people you need to catch are the ones who know what a red light means." I looked at the man and said I needed a moment to think. He nodded. I walked slowly toward the workbench, keeping my body between him and the wall-mounted electrical panel. I reached the bench and placed both hands flat on the surface, the way Claire had done in the diner when she wanted me to stop talking. But I was not stopping. I was reaching beneath the bench for the emergency alert transmitter Tomas had installed after the break-in 9 months ago. It was a single-button device wired to a relay that sent a silent signal to 3 numbers simultaneously. Tomas, Claire, and the Bernalillo County Sheriff's Dispatch. I pressed the button with my left hand while my right hand remained visible on the bench. I turned back to the man and said, "I will not sign anything. I will not withdraw anything. And you are standing in my hangar." His expression did not change. He looked at his phone and began to type something. I did not wait to find out what it was. I walked to Jesse and knelt beside the chair. I pulled the duct tape from his mouth as gently as I could manage, with hands that wanted to move faster than my discipline allowed. Jesse gasped and said, "Dad, there is another one outside." I pulled a box cutter from my coverall pocket, the same one I used to open gasket packages, and cut the zip ties on both wrists. Jesse stood up, and I pushed him behind me toward the main door. The man by the side entrance raised his voice and said, "I was making a mistake." I did not look at him. I walked Jesse to the main door and pushed it open. The morning light hit us both at the same time, warm and flat across the mesa. A black SUV was parked near the taxiway with its engine running. A second man sat in the driver's seat. He saw us emerge and shifted the vehicle into gear. But before the SUV could move, 2 Bernalillo County Sheriff's units came down the access road with their lights on, and no sirens, moving fast and quiet the way they do when they do not want to give someone time to think. Tomas arrived 30 seconds later in his gray pickup. He got out and walked directly to me and looked at Jesse, then at the hangar, then back at me. He said, "The camera got everything, boss." I put my hand on Jesse's shoulder. He was shaking. I was not. I had spent 36 years in that hangar learning one principle above all others. When a system fails, you do not panic. You identify the failed component, you isolate it, and you replace it with something that works. The deputies detained both men within 4 minutes. Claire arrived 11 minutes after that, already on the phone with Salazar. She looked at me standing in front of my hangar with my son beside me and said, "Ed, tell me you did not go in there alone." I said, "I went in there the way I always go in, knowing where everything is." The grand jury convened on a Monday morning in a courtroom I had never been inside before. Claire presented the evidence over the course of 4 hours. She began with the flight data recorder and ended with the contents of the hard drive. Dean Ochoa testified to the authenticity of every file. Sandra Fenn walked the jury through 147 payment records. Detective Salazar played 2 of the 6 recorded phone conversations between Voss and Drucker, and the room went silent in a way that reminded me of the moment between ignition and engine catch, when you do not yet know if the machine will come to life. The jury returned an indictment on 11 counts. Dominic Voss was charged with conspiracy to commit fraud, bribery of a public official, obstruction of justice, witness tampering, kidnapping, and 5 counts related to money laundering through Solaris Holdings and Redstone Advisory Group. Officer Kyle Drucker was indicted separately on 4 counts, including evidence, tampering, false reporting, and accepting bribes. A federal referral was issued for the 3 Bernalillo County Planning Commission employees identified in the Solaris payment records. Voss was located 9 days later in a rented house outside Tucson, Arizona. United States Marshals arrested him without incident at 6:15 in the morning while he was eating breakfast at a kitchen table, covered with prepaid phone packaging and a laptop that was later found to contain additional correspondence with contacts in the Cayman Islands. Claire told me the laptop alone could sustain a second federal investigation. The 2 men who had entered my hangar and held Jesse were identified as private security contractors hired through a firm in Phoenix that Voss had used on previous real estate disputes. Both were charged with kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and criminal threatening. The backup camera footage from Tomas's system was entered into evidence without objection. Margaret was not arrested. Claire told me the district attorney's office had offered her a cooperation agreement in exchange for testimony against Voss. She accepted. I learned this from Claire, not from Margaret. Because the protective order was still in effect, and I had not spoken to my wife in over 7 weeks. Claire said Margaret's testimony would fill gaps in the financial timeline that the documents alone could not explain. She said Margaret had agreed to describe how Voss had first approached her at a fundraiser 16 months before the crash and how he had framed the payments as consulting fees for community development research, the same language he had used with Jesse. Claire said Margaret claimed she did not understand the full scope of the plan until the night of the crash. I did not ask Claire whether she believed that. Some questions a man saves for a quiet room where no one else is listening. Jesse entered a separate proffer agreement. He testified before the grand jury for 2.5 hours. Claire told me afterward that he had been steady, specific, and honest. She said the jury had asked him 11 questions, and he had answered every one without hesitation. I was not in the room for his testimony. Claire said, "It was better that way." She said a father watching his son describe being recruited to destroy him was not a scene that helped anyone. The charges against me were formally dismissed on a Wednesday afternoon. Judge Montoya read the dismissal order aloud in open court. He said the evidence demonstrated a coordinated and sustained conspiracy to fabricate criminal liability against an innocent individual for the purpose of commercial land acquisition. He said the court found no credible basis for the original charges and ordered the record sealed in the interest of protecting the defendant's reputation and livelihood. Claire shook my hand in the corridor afterward. She did not hug me or say anything sentimental. She said, "Ed, the next step is a civil suit. Voss has assets. You are owed damages. Think about it." I told her I would. Tomas drove me back to the airfield that evening. We parked on the apron and walked into Hangar 2 together. The space was exactly as I had left it the morning of the rescue. The folding chair was still in the center of the floor. The cut zip ties were still on the concrete. The workbench was still covered with Claire's documents, and the box cutter I had used to free my son. Tomas and I cleaned the hangar in silence. We swept the floor, organized the tools, replaced the broken lock on cabinet 3, and repositioned the engine hoist. It took us 2 hours. When we finished, the hangar looked the way it had looked every evening for 36 years. Ready for the next job. I stood in the doorway and looked at the empty rectangle on the floor where the Beechcraft Staggerwing had sat. The plane was still impounded as evidence. Claire said it might be released in 6 to 8 months, depending on the trial schedule. I did not know whether I would restore it again. 9 years of work had ended on a highway median, under flashing lights. And some things, once broken that way, do not go back together the same. But I thought about what my father told me when I was 19 years old and rebuilding my first engine in a rented garage in Las Cruces. He said that every machine is a conversation between the person who built it and the world that will test it. He said you cannot control the world, but you can control the quality of your work. He said if you do that honestly, the machine will speak for you when you cannot speak for yourself. That is what happened. The flight data recorder spoke for me. The backup camera spoke for me. The financial records and the phone recordings and the soil samples and the blood on the second wrench, all of it spoke for me when my own family would not. I do not know what comes next for Jesse. He is living in Las Cruces again, working at a shop that restores vintage motorcycles. He calls me on Sundays. The conversations are short, careful, like two people learning a language they used to speak fluently. I do not know if we will find our way back to what we were. I do not know if what we were was ever real. But he calls. And I answer. And for now, that is enough. Margaret signed the divorce papers last month. I did not contest anything. She kept the house. I kept the hangar. I want to say one more thing to anyone who is listening. When the people closest to you decide to take everything you have built, the only thing that will save you is the truth you stored in places they did not think to look. Build your life the way you build an engine. Document every step. Verify every part. And always keep a backup system that nobody knows about. God does not promise that the people you love will be honest. God does not promise that the system will protect you before it nearly destroys you. But I believe God put steady hands in your life for a reason. Tomas was my steady hand. Claire was my steady hand. And somewhere in the middle of the worst 52 days of my life, I learned that the truth is a machine too. And once you start it, it does not stop running until every lie in its path has been cleared from the runway. My name is Ed Navarro. I am 63 years old. I have spent 36 years restoring aircraft at Double Eagle II Airport on the West Mesa of Albuquerque, New Mexico. They tried to take my hangar, my freedom, and my name. They failed, and the hangar is still here. The lights still work. The tools are in their places. And tomorrow morning, I will walk through that door the same way I always have, ready to build something that flies.